The pristine halls of the Galactic Training Academy gleamed under the artificial sunlight, their polished surfaces reflecting the diverse array of species shuffling toward their assigned classrooms. Among the towering Shinthar with their crystalline exoskeletons, the serpentine Vasith who slithered with deadly grace, and the muscular Krogath sporting their infamous bone-crushing limbs, a lone human figure stood out like a fragile flower in a field of steel. Standing at barely 5'3", the new combat instructor looked more like she had wandered into the wrong sector of the galaxy. Her athletic but small frame drew skeptical glances from passing faculty members who had all heard about the controversial appointment of a human to teach advanced combat techniques. "They sent us this?" A deep, resonating voice echoed through the combat training chamber as the first batch of students filed in. The speaker, a Krogath male named Thex, didn't bother lowering his voice. His metallic scales rippled with barely contained amusement as he took his place in the front row. The human instructor stood calmly at the center of the room, hands clasped behind her back, watching as her students arranged themselves in the traditional semicircle formation. Each species gravitated toward their own kind, a common behavior that hadn't changed even after 50 years of human integration into the Galactic Federation. Ah, yes, the integration. It had been quite the scandal when humans first approached the Federation Council. Here was a species that hadn't even mastered faster-than-light travel on their own, yet they had the audacity to request membership. The only reason they were even considered was their unexpected assistance during the hive mind incursion of 2157, when a human cargo ship crew managed to stop a Class 4 invasion using nothing but mining equipment and what they called improvised explosives. A Vasith student flicked her forked tongue, tasting the air. "I smell fear," she announced to her classmates, triggering a wave of chittering laughs. The human instructor's heart rate hadn't even flickered. "Instructor!" A crystalline voice cut through the chatter. A Shinthar raised one of their forearms, light refracting through their transparent digits. "There must be some mistake. We were promised advanced combat training. Our species have evolved natural weapons over millions of years. What could a human possibly teach us?" The quiet that followed was deafening. The instructor's brown eyes scanned the room, taking in every smirk, every dismissive gesture, every confident pose. Then, for the first time since the students had entered, she smiled. It wasn't the nervous smile they expected. It was the kind of smile that made several students instinctively take a step back. "My name is Lieutenant Joe," she announced, her voice carrying surprising authority for someone so small. "And you're right. There has been a mistake." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Your mistake was assuming that natural weapons make you a natural warrior." Lieutenant Joe stepped forward, her movements measured and precise. "Today we'll begin with a basic assessment of your capabilities. But first, I'd like each of you to demonstrate what you consider your most effective combat technique." The Krogath, Thex, immediately stepped forward, his metallic scales catching the light. "Allow me to demonstrate why this is a waste of time." Without warning, he slammed his reinforced fist into a nearby training dummy. The impact shattered the dense material, sending fragments skittering across the floor. "We Krogath can generate impact forces of over 30,000 newtons. Our scales can withstand plasma fire. What could we possibly learn from a species that needs artificial armor just to survive in space?" "Impressive," Jo commented, her voice neutral. "Anyone else?" A Vasith female named Nyx uncoiled her serpentine body to its full height, nearly touching the ceiling. Her species' neural venom could paralyze a target in seconds, and their hypnotic movements had evolved to mesmerize prey. "Our combat techniques have been perfected over millennia," she announced, executing a series of lightning-fast strikes that left after-images in the air. "We are living weapons." The Shinthar delegation moved as one, their crystalline bodies creating a dazzling light show. Their species could absorb and redirect energy, making them nearly invulnerable to most forms of attack. The lead Shinthar, who called himself Prism, demonstrated by catching a practice blast from a training weapon and sending it ricocheting around the room before harmlessly absorbing it back into his body. "Our defensive capabilities are unmatched," Prism stated, his voice resonating like wind through crystal. "We cannot be surprised, we cannot be overwhelmed, and we cannot be defeated by primitive physical attacks." The demonstrations continued. The Murga, with their ability to control local gravity fields. The Helix, whose DNA could restructure itself mid-battle to adapt to any threat. The Quantum Striders, who could partially phase out of normal spacetime to avoid attacks. Each demonstration was more impressive than the last, and with each one the smirks grew wider, the dismissive glances more obvious. Several students had started making bets on how long the human instructor would last before requesting a transfer. Lieutenant Joe had watched it all without comment, her expression unchanging. When the last student finished, she walked to the center of the training area, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. "Thank you for those demonstrations," she said, rolling her shoulders in a casual stretch. "You've shown me exactly what I expected to see. A room full of gifted individuals who have never faced real combat." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Thex's scales bristled. "You dare?" "Yes, I dare," Jo cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. "You've all shown me tricks. Impressive tricks, certainly, but tricks nonetheless. Not one of you has demonstrated actual combat awareness. Not one of you has shown tactical thinking. And most importantly," she smiled that unnerving smile again, "not one of you has considered why humans, with all our physical limitations, were chosen to teach this class." She reached down and picked up a simple training staff. No energy fields, no enhanced capabilities, just a plain metal rod. "Would anyone like to help me demonstrate why?" The challenge hung in the air for a moment before Thex let out a booming laugh. "Very well, human. Let's begin your assessment." Joe nodded and moved to the center of the training area. "We'll start with basic physical benchmarks. Each of you will complete a standard Federation combat readiness evaluation. I want to see your speed, strength, and reaction times." The Krogath went first, naturally. Thex blazed through the course, his metallic muscles propelling him at speeds that made the air crack. The reinforced training equipment groaned under his assault. When he finished, the display showed scores that would have qualified him for special operations in most military forces. "Adequate," Jo said, making a note on her datapad. "Next." The word cut through Thex's triumphant grin like a knife. "Adequate?" he sputtered. "I just broke 3 academy records." "You also telegraphed every move, wasted energy on unnecessary displays of force, and left yourself exposed no less than 7 times, Jo replied without looking up. "But we'll address that later. Next." Nyx slithered through the course with hypnotic grace, her movements so fluid they seemed to defy physics. The Helix demonstrated their adaptive abilities, their body literally evolving mid-course to overcome each obstacle. The Quantum Striders phased through solid barriers as if they weren't there. Jo watched each performance with unnerving intensity, her eyes tracking every movement, every decision. She made notes constantly, but her face revealed nothing. The only sign that she was even paying attention was the occasional slight tilt of her head or narrowing of her eyes. The tension in the room grew with each passing minute. The students had expected dismissal, ridicule, or at least intimidation from the human. Instead, they got this silent, methodical observation that somehow felt more threatening than any show of force. "Your form is sloppy," she said to a Murga who had just proudly demonstrated his gravity manipulation. "You rely too heavily on your natural abilities and ignore basic positioning." "But I completed the course in record time," the Murga protested. "You did," Jo agreed. "And in a real fight, you'd be dead in seconds because you never secured your perimeter. Again." The Shinthar delegation performed as one unit, their crystalline bodies moving in perfect synchronization. Even Jo paused in her note-taking to watch their coordinated display of energy absorption and redirection. "Better," she said when they finished. "But you're still thinking like individuals pretending to be a team. not an actual combat unit. Your coordination is aesthetically pleasing, but tactically unsound. By the end of the assessments, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The initial mockery had given way to a confused sort of frustration. Every student had performed at or above Federation combat standards. Every student had displayed abilities that would have made them legendary warriors on most worlds. And every student had been picked apart by the calm, quiet human who hadn't so much as thrown a punch. "Right," Jo said, setting down her datapad. "Now that I've seen what we have to work with, we can begin actual combat training. Unless," she glanced around the room, that unsettling smile playing at the corners of her mouth, "anyone still thinks they have nothing to learn from a human?" Thex stepped forward, his metallic scales rippling with barely contained rage. "Enough of this mockery. You've criticized everyone's performance while doing nothing yourself. Face me in actual combat, and I'll show you the difference between your theories and real power." "Ah," Jo said, picking up the simple training staff again. "I was hoping you'd say that." She gestured to the central combat ring. "Standard Federation rules. First to yield or become combat ineffective loses. Would you like the first move?" The Krogath's laughter echoed through the chamber as he stepped into the ring. "You're giving me the first move, against enhanced Krogath combat reflexes?" He settled into a fighting stance, his massive frame dwarfing the human instructor. "Your funeral." The attack came with devastating speed, a straight punch that could shatter reinforced hull plating. Several students gasped, expecting to see their instructor turned into a fine mist. Jo wasn't there. She had shifted exactly 3 inches to the left, letting the punch pass so close it ruffled her uniform. Before Thex could recover, the training staff tapped him lightly on the back of his knee. Not a strike, just a tap. "That's one," she said quietly. Thex roared, spinning with impossible speed for something his size. His tail, lined with razor-sharp scales, whipped around at chest height, a strike that would have cut an unarmored opponent in half. Jo dropped into a perfect split, the tail passing harmlessly overhead. The staff flicked out again, tapping Thex's ankle. 2! The Krogath's attacks became a blur of motion, each strike carrying enough force to reshape metal. Punches, kicks, tail swipes, even his species' signature grappling moves, all executed with textbook perfection. The training room rang with the sound of displaced air and the gasps of watching students, but he couldn't touch her. Jo moved like water, each motion flowing perfectly into the next. Where Thex's attacks were powerful and direct, her movements seemed almost lazy, as if she had all the time in the world. She never blocked, never countered. She simply wasn't where the attacks landed. And after each dodge, the staff tapped another point on Thex's body. 3, a light touch on his hip. 4, a tap on his shoulder blade. 5, a gentle prod at his lower back. The other students watched in stunned silence as their strongest classmate was systematically dismantled by a human who hadn't thrown a single punch. Some began to notice a pattern in the taps, but none could figure out its significance. Thex's frustration mounted with each failed attack. His movements became faster, more powerful, but also more erratic. Sweat began to form on his scales, something many students hadn't even known was possible for his species. "Getting tired?" Jo asked, her breathing still perfectly steady. "You've expended enough energy to power a small shuttle, while I've barely moved from this spot. Would you like to know why you can't hit me?" "Stop talking." Each word was punctuated with a strike that could level buildings. Jo ducked the first, sidestepped the second, and somehow seemed to flow around the third. "You're stronger than me," she continued, tapping his elbow. 6, faster 2, 7, a tap on his wrist. "Your reactions are enhanced. 8, another tap, this time on his spine. "You can probably bench press a transport shuttle. 9, a final tap on the back of his neck. 10. Suddenly, Thex's legs buckled. He stumbled, trying to catch himself, but his arms wouldn't respond properly. The mighty Krogath warrior collapsed to the training room floor, his muscles twitching uselessly. "What?" What did you do to me?" His voice was slurred, his mighty frame lying helpless on the ground. Joe knelt beside him, still perfectly composed. Each tap corresponded to a nerve cluster in Krogath physiology. The right pressure points, hit in the correct sequence, can temporarily disrupt your species' neuromuscular system. You'll recover in about 10 minutes with no lasting damage. She stood, addressing the stunned class. I spent 3 months studying Krogath anatomy before taking this position. I also studied Vasith pressure points, Jinthar resonance frequencies, Murgar gravitational sensitivities, and every other species' physiological weaknesses. I analyzed combat footage, medical records, and historical battle accounts. Walking to retrieve her datapad, she continued, "Humans don't have natural weapons. We can't generate massive forces, secrete paralyzing toxins, or manipulate fundamental forces of nature. What we do have is this," she tapped her temple. "We study, we plan, we adapt, and most importantly, we never assume that being naturally deadly makes you naturally good at combat." The class remained silent as Thex was helped to a recovery pod by 2 classmates. Joe waited until he was comfortable before continuing her lesson. On Earth, we developed thousands of different combat styles over our history. Not because we had natural weapons, but precisely because we didn't. We had to learn how to defeat creatures stronger, faster, and better armed than ourselves. She activated a holographic display showing ancient human combat manuals. These techniques were developed over millennia. Japanese warriors learned to use an opponent's strength against them. Chinese masters developed ways to disable enemies by targeting vital points. Russian soldiers perfected the art of turning everyday objects into weapons. Each culture, facing different challenges, created unique solutions. Nyx raised her head, forked tongue flicking thoughtfully. But surely these techniques only worked against other humans. Joe smiled. Actually, we developed them fighting everything from massive predators to armored war machines. When humans encountered a new threat, we didn't try to outmuscle it. We studied it, found its weaknesses, and developed countermeasures. The hologram shifted to show various human martial arts in action. See how this technique redirects force, or how this strike targets joint mechanisms. These principles work against any opponent, regardless of their natural advantages. It's not about being the strongest or fastest. It's about understanding how to make your opponent's strengths work against them. Prism's crystalline form shimmered with interest. Is that why the Federation chose humans as combat instructors? Because you've spent your entire history learning to defeat superior opponents? Partially, Joe acknowledged. But it's more than that. Humans don't just adapt techniques. We adapt ourselves. Every time we encounter a new challenge, we evolve our approach. We've had to because we've never been the dominant species in terms of raw capability. She gestured to the various alien students. Each of your species evolved natural weapons that made you apex predators on your worlds. But humans, we were prey animals who decided to climb to the top through sheer stubbornness and ingenuity. We don't have one perfect solution. We have thousands of imperfect solutions that we constantly refine and combine in new ways. The Helix representative shifted forward, their adaptive form rippling with curiosity. That's why you were observing us so carefully during the assessments? Exactly. I wasn't just evaluating your performance. I was analyzing how your natural abilities could be enhanced by human combat techniques. Imagine combining Vasith flexibility with human joint locks, or Krogath strength with precision striking techniques. Think about how much more effective your natural weapons would be with proper tactical application. The atmosphere in the room had transformed. The dismissive attitudes were gone, replaced by genuine interest and speculation. Students began discussing potential combinations of their abilities with human combat styles, their minds racing with new possibilities. The next few weeks transformed the combat training chamber into a laboratory of martial innovation. Where once stood proud warriors relying solely on natural abilities, now stood students eager to expand their combat repertoire. Thex, having recovered both physically and emotionally from his demonstration match, proved to be one of the most dedicated students. His naturally powerful strikes, when combined with human precision targeting, became devastatingly effective. "It's like upgrading from a sledgehammer to a surgical laser," he explained to his classmates while practicing controlled strikes on reinforced targets. The Vasith students discovered that their natural flexibility, when paired with human grappling techniques, created an entirely new form of combat. Nyx particularly excelled at combining her species' hypnotic movements with misdirection tactics, making her nearly impossible to track in combat scenarios. Perhaps most impressive was the Shinthar delegation's adaptation of human defensive techniques. Their natural ability to absorb and redirect energy, when applied with human tactical principles, allowed them to turn even the slightest attack into a devastating counterstrike. Prism led his crystalline companions in developing a new combat style that blended their natural abilities with human martial arts philosophy. Lieutenant Joe moved through the training room, making minor adjustments to stances, suggesting tactical refinements, and occasionally demonstrating new combinations. The students no longer saw her small stature as a limitation. Instead, they watched her movements with keen attention, knowing that every gesture contained lessons learned from centuries of human combat evolution. "Combat isn't about being the perfect weapon," she explained during one particularly intense training session. "It's about being the right weapon for the right moment. Humans learned this through necessity. Now you're learning it through choice, and that makes you even more formidable." On graduation day, the combat training chamber was filled with Federation officials and combat instructors from across the galaxy. They had come to witness the results of this controversial human-led training program. The demonstration that followed left them speechless. Thex and Nyx performed a synchronized combat routine that seemed to defy physics, his raw power perfectly complementing her fluid grace. The Shinthar delegation demonstrated their new defensive techniques, creating a dazzling display of redirected energy that had even veteran combat instructors taking notes. Each student showed how they had transformed their natural abilities into something entirely new through the application of human combat principles. Lieutenant Joe stood at attention, watching her students with quiet pride. When the final demonstration ended, she stepped forward to address the audience. When these students first arrived, they saw a small human trying to teach combat to natural warriors. Today, they understand a fundamental truth that humans learned long ago. True strength lies not in our natural advantages, but in our ability to adapt, learn, and grow beyond our limitations. She turned to her graduating class, standing tall despite being dwarfed by her alien students. "Remember this lesson well. The galaxy is vast, and there will always be someone stronger, faster, or more naturally gifted. But victory belongs to those who never stop learning, never stop adapting, and never underestimate anyone, not even a small human with a simple staff.